Hello guys and welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we're having a look at another boss from raid testing on the Legion Alpha with Grand Magistrix Elisande from the Nighthold.
Yes, and she's going to be one of the later bosses in the instance. She looks like she's going to be the penultimate boss according to the dungeon journal, which doesn't really mean much because they always change it about. But yeah, this is the lady that we saw at the end of the Court of Stars instance. She's the one that teleported away and has now become a boss in the Nighthold. She's like kind of the leader of the people in Suramar and the Nighthold and shit. But of course, then the Legion came along and fucked everything up.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a 3-phase fight where each phase will trigger when she gets to 10% HP. She will then reverse time to get her health back to 100%, and will then like start again with new abilities. However, some of the abilities in the previous phases will like echo through the time and carry over to the next phase. It's pretty unique.
Now before we talk about what abilities are in what phase, first let's talk about the adds that will constantly spawn throughout all of the phases. There are 2 different types of elementals that are spawned. Now, the recursive elemental, which is the blue one, is completely immobile and melee hits like a truck, so you need to make sure that your tank gets there before your melee, otherwise they're just gonna die. Whilst the elemental is active, it will apply a shield to the boss, which makes her immune to all damage. So the idea is you need to kill the ad before you can start attacking the boss again. While we were testing, this wasn't active and it wasn't actually working, so we didn't always do this.
Yeah, kind of left it sometimes.
But on live servers, you probably would send your entire raid, so your melee DPS, your range DPS, you would all swap and kill it off as soon as you possibly can. Apart from just standing there melee hitting the tank, it will also spam an ability called Blast. This is just an interruptible cast that deals a small amount of damage to a single player, not much to worry about. Now importantly, when the ad dies, it will leave a very large bubble of like slow time on the floor. This slow time bubble will apply a debuff to anyone who goes inside it. This debuff will reduce your casting, movement speed, attack speed, and cooldown recharge rate, and periodic tick rates by 30% for 10 seconds. So don't go in it.
It's like an anti-bloodlust. You don't want to go in there at all.
Now the other elemental that spawns is the expedient pink elemental. This elemental is mobile and does need to be picked up by the tank as soon as possible, and again also hits like a truck. Now apart from just melee hitting, it will also cast exothermic release, which again is another interruptible cast that will deal a burst of damage to the entire raid, and each successful cast deals 5% more damage than the previous cast. So this one is a little bit more important to interrupt compared to the blue one. Now when the pink elemental dies, it leaves a large pink bubble of fast time on the floor. Now this works the same way as slow time, except in reverse, so instead of losing 30% of everything we mentioned previously, you now have 30% more of it. It's basically bloodlust on crack. Now each time you do enter this bubble to refresh your buff, it does get slightly smaller, so you can't use it forever. The idea is that you only send in important targets, such as pretty much DPS only, just to go in there, refresh their buff, go in and out each time they need to do it, just to keep high buff uptime. Also, interestingly enough, if you have the slow time debuff by accident, you can just go in the fast bubble and that will remove the slow one and then grant you the fast one.
Yeah, which is pretty nice.
But it also works the other way around.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
So
That's
yeah,
bad.
Don't do that.
Now, not only do these bubbles affect you by giving you all these lovely or bad buffs, they actually affect certain boss abilities by making them either speed up or slow down depending on which one of these time pools they go through. Now, not all of the abilities are affected by this, and I think it's about time that we have a look at them. So let's see what the boss is actually doing. Now, when you pull the boss, she'll start off in phase 1, and she'll immediately mark an area on the floor and teleport there. When she does arrive, she'll do a burst of damage to anyone nearby. So when we pulled the boss, we made sure that everyone moved away from that marked area just to avoid that like easily avoidable burst of damage. Now, something for your tanks to worry about is ablation. This is a stacking dot that is applied to the tank, and there's nothing really else to it. You just want to taunt whenever you can, but you might find yourselves in situations where taunting isn't always possible because you have to be out of the raid tanking elementals or something like that, so sometimes it might stack up a little bit high, so just get ready to change some personal cooldowns and you'll be fine. Now, one mechanic that's supposed to be very impactful but ends up pretty much doing nothing is Permalative Torment. This is a debuff applied to several players which just deals some ticking damage. However, when we were testing it, the dot did so little damage that you could, ignore it entirely. You didn't have to do anything special with it. However, in the dungeon journal, it is marked as deadly, and it also says that the damage is supposed to ramp up every single time it does ticking damage. So, I guess it was supposed to be doing 10 million times more damage than it was doing. And if this is the case, so it's either ticking very, very hard, or it's just ticking very, very quickly, and your healers can't heal you up in time, you might actually need to utilize the slow time bubble that you're given from the blue ad. This will allow you, when you go inside it, for the dot to tick slower. it will last 30% longer, but because the dots are 30% more spread out, that will give your healers enough time to heal you up. So if you do reach this on live and you're like, holy shit, it's destroying us, feel free to use those blue bubbles because they will help your healers, even though you'll be kind of doing a lot less damage because you've kind of got negative bloodlust on you. It is worth it because at least you'll stay alive. And the final mechanic the boss is doing in this phase is our kinetic ring, and it's probably the most impactful. She will summon a ton of orbs all around the edges of the room. These orbs will then travel towards her, dealing a huge amount of damage to any one hit. Now, any orbs that travel for a patch of time will either become faster or slower depending on which one they go through, like we explained earlier. So when one of these orbs does go through one of the patches, it will actually leave a gap for your raid group to move through in order to avoid all of the damage. Regardless if it's faster or slower, there will be a little gap in the ring and you should be able to pass through it pretty quickly. However, this wasn't really necessary at all. Because the orbs decrease in size as they travel towards the boss, this allows you to position the boss on one side of the pillar and have most of the raid on the other side. By the time the orbs reached that pillar in the middle, they were kind of small enough that several gaps had appeared between them, allowing you to kind of simply move through them without having to worry about any fast or slow time patches at all. We found this to be a much more consistent and easy way of dealing with the orbs, because otherwise you have to worry about where the patches are, where do we position the boss. There's loads more thinking, and really, if you hug the pillar and have the boss on the other side of the pillar, it's super simple. Just stand next to it and you'll be able to easily navigate through these little gaps between them.
Or you could just be a mage or a druid and blink.
Yeah, apparently you can double jump over them as a demon hunter as well, I heard. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, but yeah, you can always try and jump and fail horribly and everyone will laugh, but at least we'll know for science.
Now, as we explained at the start of the video, once the boss reaches 10% health, she will freeze everyone, rewind time, and when she does this, all the patches in the room will disappear and she'll gain 100% health, and this is when a new phase will kick in. During testing, the raid didn't actually gain anything from this, such as like CDs or health or mana pools or anything like that. It just is literally a phase transition where everything gets despawned and she gains health. Now in phase 2, the boss will spawn a mirror image of itself, and it just seems to spawn randomly in certain locations of the room. Now this ad will continue to cast our kinetic ring, just like you had to deal with in phase 1. However, instead of the orbs going towards the boss, it will go towards the mirror ad. Now this doesn't really change your strategy and how you deal with the ability, but instead of you positioning yourself based on where the boss is, you just need to position yourself based on where the ad is. Again, just using the pillar, finding the gaps, running through the gaps, and you're absolutely fine. And do keep in mind, this mirror image ad, you can't do any damage to it or anything like that. You cannot kill it. You just have to keep dealing with that ability throughout the entire phase. She'll also continue to spawn the blue and pink elemental throughout this phase. Once again, they are #1 DPS priority. You need to kill them off as soon as you possibly can, and ideally get the buff from the pink one. So on top of the orbs and the ads, the boss will also gain 3 new abilities that you have to deal with. Tanks will now be hit with a new debuff called Baiting Explosion. The way it works is that the boss applies it to you, and then after it expires, it explodes and deals a load of damage. However, the amount of damage that it was dealing was very, very little, and the debuff didn't apply quick enough for it to actually stack to a significant amount. Now, the Dungeon Journal suggests this ability does 1 mil arcane fall-off damage to all enemies from the point of the target. So basically, when the tank explodes, it deals damage to everyone. And by the sounds of it, the further away you are, the less damage you take.
Yeah, I've never heard of fall-off damage before, but that seems to be the most logical thing. So I guess when this comes in, you're supposed to deal with it the same way that you would deal with like many of these other debuffs. You get it on you, fuck off so you don't explode on the entire raid and you don't kill everyone. You just have to do that each time, and that will promote a tank switch, but otherwise, at least on testing, you didn't need to tank switch at all.
Another debuff that's in play in this phase is Delphuric Beam. What the boss will do is pick random raid members, place the debuff on top of them, and then over the course of its duration, the boss will just fire beams towards those players. Now, these beams do quite a lot of damage, and they also do damage to anyone that's directly in the beam, regardless if you have the debuff or not. So when these players get this debuff, they need to make sure that they fan out away from the boss, make sure that no one's in between them, and everyone else kind of needs to be independent and make sure that they're not standing inside the lines as well. And as you can see from the footage, quite a lot of people get this. So this is probably one of the hardest part of the phase. If you're good at Archimon dealing with Wrought and Focus Chaos, or maybe like the Mark of Deaths on Blackhand, I guess, then you'd be pretty good at dealing with this mechanic as well. It's more or less the same thing. And the other ability to deal with in this phase is Epocheric Orb. When this is cast, various orbs will start falling towards the ground. Now, if they reach the ground, they'll do a high amount of damage to the raid, about 1 million. However, if someone stands directly underneath them and soaks them before they hit the ground, it will just deal damage to that player instead, and that amount of damage is pretty similar to the amount of AoE damage that they would have taken anyway. So in ways, these orbs are very similar to Korag in High Maul. If you've done that fight before, you'll know exactly how to deal with these. You just send a player out there, stand underneath them, they'll take a bit of damage, and it avoids the rest of the raid taking any damage whatsoever. Interestingly enough with these orbs, which is probably quite important as well actually, is that as they fall through a time zone, if they so happen to spawn over one, they'll move either faster or slower depending on which one it is.
Yeah.
So on Mythic, you might see some bullshit wipes where an orb spawns in a fast one and you know, maybe it's on the other side of the room and you don't have time to run over there and soak it. But yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't fuck things up. I think it's quite interesting and cool nonetheless, and it doesn't really change anything. You just got to keep your eye out, because you do have quite a lot of time for the orbs to fall anyway. So assuming you can catch the varying orbs, as well as dodging the beams and the tanks, well, you just have to stand there. I assume you have to run out, but on testing, you just have to stand there, as well as dealing with all of the orbs coming from the side of the room, from the Echo. Once you get the boss to 10% health, she will once again freeze time and then transition into Phase 3, the exact same way she did before. Now in Phase 3, she will continue to do the echo of the Arcanetic Ring ability from Phase 1, and she will now start echoing the Delphuric Beam ability from Phase 2. Now this means that you'll now have two mirror images that will be doing different things, and you need to react to them in different ways. With the Arcanetic Ring ability, of course you need to be on the other side of the pillar. However, with the Delphuric Beam ability, you got to make sure there's nobody between you and the mirror image. So you got to keep an eye out, you got to see what's going on, because otherwise you might be positioned incorrectly and either be caught out by an orb or just put a beam through your entire raid. Now you still do get the two elementals that will spawn, and they once again just need to be killed off as soon as possible because they're a massive pain in the arse and they hurt the tank so fucking much. And of course you want to get the pink buff because you want to be doing more and more damage. So apart from the Echo Orbs and the Echo Beams, the boss will have three entirely new abilities in Phase 3. The tanks will have Ablative Pulse. This is a cast on you which will do a large amount of magic damage, and it will also apply a debuff which will increase the damage that you take from this ability by 10%, and this will just keep stacking up and up and up. It is actually marked in the dungeon journal that you can interrupt this. However, that was not the case during testing. It was completely uninterruptible. So because of this, we just made it so our tanks taunt whenever possible, just to keep the stacks to a minimum, because it already hurts quite a lot just as the base amount, let alone with stacks. A pretty devastating ability if you don't deal with it correctly is Conflexive Burst. This is a debuff applied to a few players, and the debuff itself doesn't actually do anything. However, when it expires, it will explode, dealing a very large burst of damage to the entire raid. Now, all of the debuffs are applied at the exact same time, and they will all explode at the exact same time, and if they all go off at once, you are pretty much gonna wipe. Luckily, you do have the time patches to alter the durations of the debuffs. Ideally, you'd have one player to go inside a fast bubble, making it so the debuff explodes early. You have another player go inside a slow bubble to make sure it explodes much, much later. And then you'll just have one player not go inside either of them, so the debuff will just explode at the intended time. This would stagger the debuffs by a large amount, allowing your healers to easily top everyone up in between each explosion. However, when this debuff came in when we were testing it, we actually only had access to a fast bubble, as the blue ad hadn't died yet because we weren't focusing it properly. We just had two of our players go inside the fast bubble in like a staggered fashion. This did split up the explosions enough that they didn't one-shot us, but it was pretty fucking sketchy. Like, we went very, very low, so you do need to be careful about this. One kind of sad thing about this ability is that the boss seemed to be bugged, as she only cast this ability once at the very beginning of the phase, and she never cast it again, and it's probably one of my favorite abilities of the phase because you actually actively need to use the time portals. So yeah, this phase was a little bit easier than it should be. You would normally have to be dealing with these debuffs on top of everything else quite frequently. Now, the last thing that everyone will have to deal with is Spanning Singularity. This will immediately deal a burst of damage on top of a couple of players and leave behind a permanent pool of goo. Now, this goo does very high ticking damage to anyone stood inside it, so you cannot just sit in there and heal through it. Now, because you don't know who is going to be hit by this, and of course without timers we didn't know when it was going to happen, we decided to have everyone stand away from the pillars as much as possible, only ever returning to avoid the orbs that appear from the echoed Arcanetic Ring ability. This made it a hell of a lot easier to avoid all the orbs whizzing towards us from the side of the room, because of course there was no patches in the middle, making it so you could easily hug the pillar and not get fucked over. However, even when we were doing it like this, the room would actually start filling up pretty fast, and even if you place one in a bad position, it would screw you over quite a lot. So we decided to start rotating around the room as a group to make sure that we had as much space as we possibly could just to avoid the orbs. And As long as you could do that, so pretty much this phase is entirely deal with the complexive burst debuffs by going in the correct time portal, just assigning who goes into which time patch, even though it only happens once, and that's very, very sad. Try and interrupt the uninterruptible cast that's coming from the boss, as well as, of course, placing these pools of shit away from the group, as well as dealing with the 2 echoes, so you're dealing with the orbs, you're dealing with the beams. Assuming you can do that, which actually sounds like quite a lot now that I've mentioned it, considering you have ads on top of it, it is actually pretty crazy, this last phase, but assuming you can deal with it, that's it. That's the fight.
That is the encounter. So phase 3 is just mental,
yes,
really, if you think about it. There's so many different things going on. It's kind of nice that while we were testing, you only did see the burst ability once, because I think if we saw it more, I think we would have struggled a little
probably.
bit. But ultimately, yeah, so it's a shame that the fight was so buggy.
Yeah, it was.
There were quite a lot of abilities that didn't work, primarily tank debuffs. So yeah, testing for the tanks was a little bit dull, and as a result, it was a little bit dull for the healers as well, I'd say.
Yeah, apart from when they were
apart
tanking
from the
ads.
last phase,
and
yeah, when the tanks are actually on the ads. Phase 3 is actually mental.
Yes, it is.
There's a lot of shit going on. We were lucky that we didn't have to deal with the burst ability. Well, we only had to deal with it once, because I think we would have struggled if we actually kept going. But it shows also how the rest of the fight is super dull. Like phase 1 and 2, in my opinion, they just go on for too long. There's not enough abilities.
Yeah, and the thing is, because a lot of the abilities were buggy, maybe it made it so, you know, like the tank debuff, it wasn't exploding with fall-off damage. I don't know what the fuck that is, but yeah, it wasn't exploding with that fall-off damage, so you didn't have to react to it that much. And yeah, because the abilities were so low impact, and they didn't really seem to come in that often, like you could kind of ignore quite a lot of it, and that did definitely take away from the excitement of at least phase 1 and 2. But once you got into phase 3, it's everything suddenly went to like 1,000,000%. It felt like it went too crazy because the phase 2 was so simple. It was kind of like, I don't know, you're doing the first boss of an instance and then it's suddenly, oh, here's the last boss on Mythic. Have fun. It's like, oh, it's too much going on at once. But it's great. I really, really liked it.
That said, yeah, no, it is a good encounter.
Yeah.
But I think it could be easily improved if they just maybe either shortened phase 1 and 2, or just made it so the abilities came in a little bit more frequently, or even add an extra ability for phase 1 and 2.
Potentially. One thing that I did find a little bit sad is that there's like a surprising lack of synergy with the time patches.
Is that a timer thing, though?
Maybe. The thing is that the time patches, like, I expected to have to use them. And in all fairness, with the complexive burst in the last phase, unless you're using a shit ton of, like, damage reduction cooldowns, you will have to use the time patches. But in every other phase, you can get away with not having to use them.
I don't know, they're kind of useful in the orbs, and you have to deal with the orbs in every single phase. So.
Yeah, but the thing is, you can completely negate
it.
You can negate it. I think it's personally easier not to use the time patches for that. Pretty much you get a Bloodlust patch, which is great. Everyone wants the Bloodlust. And then the slow time patch doesn't do anything. You don't have to use it. And I think that's a little bit of a shame. Maybe
but that might be, like I said, it might be because the timing of spells, they're not coming out frequently enough, or they're not tuned high enough, such as the debuff that does the ticking damage. And
in the phase 1, yeah. No, you're probably right about that. Maybe once the like abilities become more impactful, you'd find more use of the time patches.
But right now, from doing the testing, it didn't feel that necessary, really.
No, exactly. So yeah, I think it definitely has really good potential. Like a very small amount of tweaks would make it so this boss is actually really, really good. But while we were testing it, a lot of people were like, holy fuck, can we get to phase 3 now? And like the fight until phase 3 was pretty dull. But yeah, I love the whole echo through time ability. Shit looks like it's going to go crazy in Mythic. Like the orbs are going to be pulsing in and out. They're not going to collapse properly. They're going to be going crazy, and there's going to be more abilities echoing. It's going to be nuts. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
For sure. Well, thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little boss preview, then please do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. And we shall see you in the next videos.
Thanks for watching.